Welcome back to History Bedtime Stories, where we journey through time to uncover the fascinating lives of history's most intriguing figures. Tonight, we venture into 18th century Prussia to explore the remarkable life of one of history's most complex and influential rulers, Frederick the Great. Pull up your covers, settle in comfortably, and let us transport you to a world of royal courts, battlefield genius, and enlightened philosophy, where a young prince would transform into one of Europe's most formidable leaders and thinkers. Our story begins in the winter of 1712, in the royal palace of Berlin, where the cry of a newborn baby would herald the arrival of a future king whose name would echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. In the cold January air of 1712, as snow blanketed the Prussian capital of Berlin, Queen Sophia Dorothea held her newborn son close to her chest. Little did she know that this infant, Frederick II, would one day be called the Great and would reshape not only Prussia but the entire balance of power in Europe. The baby's father, King Frederick William I, was a man of contradictions, a ruler who valued military precision above all else, yet who would unknowingly nurture in his son a love for arts, philosophy, and intellectual pursuits that would define Frederick's reign. The tension between father and son would become one of the most dramatic royal conflicts in European history, shaping the character of a future king in ways no one could have predicted. Frederick William I was known throughout Europe as the Soldier King. He had transformed Prussia from a relatively minor German state into a military powerhouse, building one of the most disciplined armies on the continent. Every aspect of Prussian society was organized around military efficiency. The king rose at 4 in the morning, conducted his affairs with the precision of a drill sergeant, and expected the same level of discipline from everyone around him, especially his heir. His daily routine was rigid as clockwork. Morning prayers at precisely 5 o'clock, administrative work from 6 to 8, military reviews from 8 to 10, followed by detailed inspections of barracks, arsenals, and fortifications. He despised luxury in all its forms, wore simple blue military uniforms even to the most elaborate state occasions, and viewed any form of artistic expression as frivolous waste of resources that could better be spent on military equipment and training. The Soldier King's approach to governance was revolutionary for its time, but in ways that few contemporaries fully understood or appreciated. He created what was essentially the first modern bureaucratic state, with detailed record-keeping systems, standardized administrative procedures, and a professional civil service selected on the basis of merit rather than birth or connections. Every aspect of government was meticulously documented, systematically analyzed, and continuously optimized for maximum efficiency and effectiveness. Tax collection became predictable and systematic rather than arbitrary and corrupt. Military recruitment followed established quotas and standardized procedures that ensured fairness and effectiveness. And even the royal household was run with the same military precision that characterized the army itself. This systematic approach extended to every corner of Prussian life. The king established detailed regulations governing everything from the height of buildings in Berlin to the precise uniforms worn by different ranks of civil servants. He created comprehensive statistical records of population, agricultural production, and military resources that provided an unprecedented level of detailed information about the state's capabilities and needs. This data-driven approach to governance was far ahead of its time and provided the foundation for the administrative excellence that would become a hallmark of the Prussian government under Frederick the Great. Young Frederick, however, showed early signs of being cut from entirely different cloth. While his father dreamed of military parades and perfect formations, the prince was drawn to books, music, and philosophical discussions that seemed to transport him to worlds far beyond the confines of Prussian military discipline. He displayed an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond Prussia's borders, learning French with remarkable fluency, mastering Latin grammar and literature, and later developing a passionate interest in the works of Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers whose ideas about reason, justice, and human nature would profoundly influence his understanding of kingship and governance. By the age of 7, Frederick was already showing signs of exceptional intelligence and creativity that set him apart not just from other royal children but from most adults in the Prussian court. The Queen, Sophia Dorothea, came from the House of Hanover and brought with her a cosmopolitan outlook that contrasted sharply with her husband's austere militarism and narrow focus on Prussian interests. She had been raised in a court environment where intellectual conversation, artistic patronage, and cultural refinement were valued alongside political and military achievements. Her upbringing in Hanover had exposed her to the broader currents of European thought, literature, and music, and she maintained extensive correspondence with scholars, artists, and intellectuals throughout Germany and beyond. The Queen possessed a sophisticated understanding of European culture and politics that made her an invaluable source of education and inspiration for her intellectually gifted son. Sophia Dorothea recognized her son's exceptional abilities early in his childhood and secretly encouraged his intellectual pursuits, perhaps without fully realizing how this nurturing of his natural talents and interests would create an almost unbridgeable gulf between father and son that would dominate their relationship for decades. In her private chambers, carefully hidden away from the king's watchful and disapproving eye, she would read to Frederick from works of French literature and classical philosophy, planting seeds of intellectual curiosity and cultural sophistication that would later bloom into his lifelong love of learning and artistic expression. She taught him French poetry by heart, introduced him to the rich traditions of classical mythology and ancient history, and encouraged his remarkable musical talents by secretly arranging for private flute lessons with some of the finest musicians in Berlin. The Queen also shared with Frederick her extensive correspondence with scholars and artists throughout Europe, giving him early exposure to the intellectual debates and cultural movements that were shaping European thought during the early 18th century. Through his mother's connections, Frederick learned about the latest developments in philosophy, science, literature, and the arts, creating in him a sophisticated understanding of European culture that far exceeded what might normally be expected from a young Prussian prince focused primarily on military training and administrative preparation for kingship. As Frederick grew from child to adolescent, the differences between his natural inclinations and intellectual interests and his father's rigid expectations became increasingly pronounced and impossible to ignore. The soldier king wanted his heir to be a military commander first and foremost, someone who would continue and expand his work of building Prussia's military might and transforming the kingdom into a major European power through discipline, efficiency, and unwavering focus on military excellence. But Frederick consistently showed more genuine interest in playing the flute and composing music than in drilling with toy soldiers, more fascination with French poetry and philosophical discussions than with Prussian military manuals and the technical details of fortification and artillery. The young prince would often be found reading Racine or Corneille when he was supposed to be studying military engineering, and his tutors frequently complained to the king that Frederick seemed more interested in philosophical discussions about justice, governance, and human nature than in learning the practical skills of military command and political leadership that would be essential to his success as a ruler. This pattern of behavior deeply frustrated Frederick William I, who saw his son's intellectual interests not as valuable additions to his education but as dangerous distractions that would make him soft and unsuitable for the harsh realities of royal power in 18th century Europe. The young prince's tutors quickly noticed his exceptional intelligence and remarkable ability to absorb and synthesize complex ideas. Jacques Duhan de Jandun, his French tutor and one of the most influential figures in Frederick's early intellectual development, was particularly struck by the prince's ability to absorb complex philosophical and literary concepts and express them with remarkable sophistication and insight for someone of his age. Duhan noted in his private correspondence that Frederick possessed not just an unusually quick memory but genuine understanding and analytical ability, and could engage in sophisticated philosophical discussions that would challenge university professors and established scholars. The tutor took it upon himself to introduce Frederick to the works of Pierre Bell, Michel de Montaigne, and other French intellectuals whose writings on skepticism, religious tolerance, and rational governance would profoundly influence the future king's approach to philosophy and statecraft. Through these readings and discussions, Duhan opened windows to a world of ideas and intellectual possibilities that would profoundly influence Frederick's thinking about the nature of government, the responsibilities of rulers, and the proper relationship between royal power and individual liberty. However, this intellectual flowering and cultural education occurred against the backdrop of steadily increasing tension and conflict with his father, who viewed these developments with growing alarm and frustration. Frederick William I regarded his son's intellectual interests and cultural sophistication as frivolous distractions from the serious business of kingship and military leadership. He believed that a king should be, above all else, a soldier and military commander, someone whose primary focus was on building and leading armies rather than on abstract philosophical discussions or artistic pursuits that had no direct relevance to the practical challenges of governing and defending the state. The king grew increasingly frustrated with Frederick's apparent lack of genuine enthusiasm for military affairs and his tendency to approach even military subjects from an overly intellectual and theoretical perspective, rather than focusing on practical training and hands-on experience. Frederick William I would often burst into Frederick's private chambers unannounced, confiscating books and musical instruments, and flying into rages about his heir becoming soft, effeminate, and fundamentally unsuitable for the harsh realities and demanding responsibilities of royal power in the competitive and dangerous world of European politics. The king's attempts to force his son into a more martial mindset and redirect his interests toward military and administrative matters only served to drive Frederick further into his books, musical instruments, and secret intellectual pursuits. Frederick William I instituted an increasingly rigorous and demanding schedule of military training, administrative duties, and physical exercise specifically designed to toughen his son both physically and mentally and redirect his natural talents and interests toward more practical and immediately useful areas of study and development. The prince was required to rise at dawn every morning, participate in lengthy and demanding military drills designed to build both physical stamina and familiarity with military procedures, study mathematics and military engineering for several hours each day, and spend long periods observing and participating in the detailed work of government administration. The king hoped that this intensive exposure to the practical aspects of military command and civil governance would gradually overcome Frederick's natural inclination toward intellectual and artistic pursuits and transform him into the kind of practical, militarily focused ruler that Prussia needed. But Frederick proved remarkably resistant to his father's determined attempts at behavioral modification and character transformation. While he would dutifully comply with the outward requirements of his father's demanding schedule, he found increasingly creative and sophisticated ways to pursue his genuine intellectual interests and maintain his inner life of philosophical reflection and artistic expression. He learned to hide books inside military manuals so he could read literature and philosophy during supposedly military study sessions, composed complex musical pieces in his head during boring administrative meetings and military reviews, and maintained an extensive secret correspondence with scholars, philosophers, and intellectuals throughout Europe using elaborate codes and covert communication networks. This covert intellectual life required considerable skill, deception, and psychological sophistication that would serve Frederick extremely well in his later career as a ruler and military commander. The necessity of concealing his true interests and maintaining a facade of compliance with his father's expectations taught him invaluable lessons about the importance of controlling information, managing appearances, and maintaining psychological distance between his public persona and private thoughts and feelings. The relationship between father and son deteriorated rapidly and dramatically as Frederick entered his teenage years, and the fundamental incompatibility between their personalities and values became impossible to ignore or suppress. What had begun as disappointment and frustration on the king's part gradually evolved into open hostility, public humiliation, and increasingly harsh attempts to force Frederick into conformity with his father's vision of proper royal behavior and priorities. Frederick William I would deliberately and publicly humiliate his son during court ceremonies and state functions, calling him weak, effeminate, and fundamentally unsuitable for kingship in front of foreign ambassadors, Prussian nobles, and other important courtiers whose respect and support Frederick would need when he eventually became king. During elaborate state dinners and diplomatic receptions, the king would make cutting and sarcastic remarks about his son's intellectual interests and cultural sophistication, publicly mocking his love of French culture and literature and suggesting that Frederick's philosophical inclinations made him unsuitable for ruling a serious military power like Prussia. These deliberate public humiliations and psychological attacks left deep and lasting emotional scars on the young prince, who began to develop the careful, calculating, and emotionally guarded nature that would later serve him so well as a ruler, but also contributed to his reputation for coldness and emotional distance. Frederick learned to control his emotions and reactions with remarkable discipline, to present a composed and dignified exterior even when experiencing intense inner turmoil and psychological pain, and to analyze situations with detached rationality rather than allowing emotional reactions to cloud his judgment or influence his decisions. These hard-learned skills, born of necessity in his traumatic relationship with his father, would prove absolutely invaluable when he later faced the complex challenges of kingship, military command, and diplomatic negotiation. The psychological armor that Frederick developed during these difficult years enabled him to function effectively under enormous pressure and to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by emotional considerations that might compromise his effectiveness as a leader. The breaking point in the deteriorating relationship between father and son came in 1730 when Frederick was 18 years old and could no longer bear the constant criticism, public humiliation, and harsh treatment that had characterized his daily life for years. Unable to endure his father's psychological abuse any longer, the desperate crown prince hatched an audacious and ultimately catastrophically ill-conceived plan to escape Prussia altogether and seek refuge with his maternal relatives in England. Along with his close friend and fellow officer Hans Hermann von Katt, who shared Frederick's intellectual interests and provided emotional support during the darkest periods of his relationship with his father, Frederick developed an elaborate plan to flee to England, where his uncle King George II might be willing to offer him refuge and protection from his father's wrath. The escape plan was remarkably sophisticated and required careful coordination, detailed planning, and considerable courage on the part of both young men, who understood that discovery would result in severe punishment and possibly even execution for treason. Frederick and Katt planned to use a routine military inspection tour as cover for their flight, gradually working their way toward the border while maintaining the appearance of conducting legitimate official business. They had secretly established contact with British diplomatic agents and believed they had secured reliable promises of safe passage and royal protection once they managed to reach English territory. The plan represented Frederick's last desperate hope of breaking free from his father's psychological domination and creating an independent life for himself where his intellectual interests and cultural sophistication would be valued rather than despised. However, the elaborate escape attempt was discovered before it could be executed, leading to one of the most traumatic and psychologically devastating episodes in Frederick's young life. A loyal officer who had observed suspicious activities and secretive behavior reported his concerns to King Frederick William I, who immediately launched a comprehensive investigation that quickly uncovered the full extent of the conspiracy and the detailed planning that had gone into the escape attempt. The king's reaction to the discovery of his son's planned flight was one of absolute fury and rage that seemed to border on madness. He saw the escape attempt not merely as teenage rebellion or emotional desperation, but as the ultimate betrayal by his heir, an act of treason that threatened the stability of the dynasty and the security of the state. Frederick William I's rage was further intensified by the enormous international embarrassment and diplomatic damage that the scandal would cause Prussia if news of the Crown Prince's attempted flight became widely known among European courts. The soldier king ordered both Frederick and Kat to be immediately arrested and court-martialed for desertion, treason, and conspiracy against the state. He was so completely consumed with rage and feelings of betrayal that he initially demanded that both young men be executed as traitors, though he was eventually persuaded by his most trusted counselors that executing the crown prince would be both politically disastrous for Prussia's international standing and dynastically suicidal for the Hohenzollern family's future. However, Frederick William I remained absolutely determined to teach his son the ultimate lesson about the consequences of disobedience, disloyalty, and betrayal of royal duty. While the crown prince's life would be spared, his friend and co-conspirator Hans Hermann von Katt would not be so fortunate. Despite desperate appeals for mercy from Frederick, various court officials, and even some foreign diplomats who feared that executing Kat would set a dangerous precedent for the treatment of young nobles throughout Europe, the soldier king remained inflexible in his determination to make an example that would forever shape his son's understanding of the price of defying royal authority. In perhaps the cruelest and most psychologically devastating twist of all, Frederick William I commanded that his imprisoned son be forced to watch Kat's execution from his prison window, ensuring that Frederick would be compelled to witness the ultimate consequence of his rebellion and bear the psychological burden of responsibility for his friend's death for the rest of his life. On November 6, 1730, 18-year-old Frederick watched in absolute horror and devastating grief as his closest friend and fellow conspirator was beheaded in the courtyard below his prison window. The execution was carried out with deliberate ceremony and public display, specifically designed to maximize its psychological impact on the imprisoned prince and create a lasting traumatic memory that would serve as a permanent reminder of the consequences of defying royal authority and state power. Contemporary accounts describe Frederick as being completely overwhelmed with grief, guilt, and psychological trauma, blaming himself entirely for Kat's death and recognizing with devastating clarity that his closest friend had paid the ultimate price for Frederick's own rebellion against his father's authority and expectations. The young prince reportedly collapsed in his cell and remained in a state of deep depression and emotional devastation for weeks following the execution. This traumatic and life-altering event marked a fundamental and permanent turning point in Frederick's character, worldview, and approach to human relationships. The sensitive, idealistic, and emotionally open young prince began to develop the emotional armor, psychological distance, and cold rationality that would later make him such an effective, if often ruthless and emotionally distant, ruler and military commander. Frederick learned through this devastating experience to hide his true feelings behind an impenetrable mask of cold rationality and composed dignity, and to never again allow himself to be completely emotionally vulnerable to another person's power over him. The execution of Kat taught Frederick that sentiment, personal loyalty, and emotional attachments were dangerous luxuries that a future king simply could not afford to indulge, and that survival in the brutal world of royal politics required a hardness of heart and emotional detachment that few people could achieve or sustain. The psychological impact of witnessing his friend's execution cannot be overstated in terms of its influence on Frederick's later development as a ruler and military commander. The experience created in him a permanent sense of guilt and responsibility that would influence his decision-making for the rest of his life, while also teaching him that personal relationships could be used as weapons by enemies and that emotional vulnerability was a potentially fatal weakness in the dangerous world of royal politics. Following this devastating crisis and trauma, There was a gradual and superficial period of reconciliation between father and son, though the relationship was permanently altered and was built more on mutual exhaustion and resignation than on genuine understanding or affection. Frederick publicly submitted to his father's will and authority, agreeing to focus on his military and administrative education with the proper seriousness and dedication that his father had always demanded. He was given a formal commission in the Prussian army and began to learn the practical aspects of military command, military engineering, and civil administration under the close supervision of trusted officers and experienced administrators who reported regularly to the king about Frederick's progress and behavior. This period of supervised training and education provided Frederick with invaluable practical experience in the actual mechanics of government and military leadership that would serve him extremely well when he eventually became king. However, despite his outward compliance and apparent conversion to his father's priorities and values, Frederick privately continued his philosophical studies and maintained an extensive secret correspondence with leading Enlightenment thinkers throughout Europe, particularly Voltaire, who would become one of his most important intellectual influences and sometime friend. The prince had learned to be much more discreet and sophisticated about his intellectual pursuits, developing elaborate systems of coded correspondence, secret meetings, and covert communication networks that allowed him to maintain his rich inner intellectual life while satisfying his father's demands for outward conformity to military and administrative priorities. This period of secret intellectual activity and covert philosophical education was crucial to Frederick's development as a future enlightened monarch and helped him develop the complex synthesis of practical political skills and sophisticated intellectual understanding that would characterize his later reign. The necessity of maintaining this double life also further developed his skills in deception, information management, and psychological manipulation that would prove invaluable in his later careers as a military commander and diplomatic negotiator. The young prince proved to be a remarkably quick learner in military affairs once he applied his considerable intelligence and analytical abilities seriously to the subject of warfare and military leadership. His natural intelligence and strategic thinking, combined with his extensive reading in military history and theoretical works on strategy and tactics, made him an unusually effective and innovative officer who quickly earned the respect of experienced military commanders and veteran soldiers. Frederick began to earn grudging respect and even admiration from his demanding father and other senior military commanders as they recognized that his intellectual approach to warfare could produce genuine practical advantages and innovative solutions to tactical and strategic problems. Rather than simply memorizing established procedures and traditional approaches, Frederick studied warfare as a science, analyzing the campaigns of great commanders from Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar to Marlborough and Prince Eugene, looking for patterns and principles that could be applied to contemporary conditions and adapted to Prussia's specific strategic situation. This intellectual and analytical approach to military science, combined with his natural talent for strategic thinking and tactical innovation, began to set Frederick apart from other officers in the Prussian army and attracted the attention of seasoned veterans who recognized exceptional ability and potential when they encountered it. His reputation for military competence and innovative thinking gradually helped to repair his relationship with his father and demonstrated that Frederick could successfully combine intellectual sophistication with practical effectiveness in ways that enhanced rather than compromised his value as a future king and military leader. In 1733, Frederick's life took another significant and politically important turn when he was married to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Bevern, a carefully arranged match designed by his father to serve purely political and diplomatic purposes rather than personal happiness or romantic compatibility. The marriage was specifically intended to strengthen Prussia's diplomatic position within the complex web of German states and provide an heir to continue the Hohenzollern dynasty into the next generation. Elizabeth Christine was reportedly a pleasant, well-educated, and socially accomplished young woman who possessed the conventional virtues expected of an 18th-century royal bride, but she had little understanding of or sympathy for Frederick's complex personality, intellectual interests, and psychological makeup. The fundamental incompatibility between Frederick's sophisticated intellectual nature and Elizabeth Christine's more conventional and traditional approach to royal life meant that their marriage was doomed from the beginning to be a formal arrangement rather than a genuine partnership. The marriage was never a happy one in any personal or emotional sense, as Frederick had little genuine interest in his wife beyond the political necessity of their union, while Elizabeth Christine had even less understanding of the psychological complexities, intellectual interests, and emotional needs that drove her husband's behavior and shaped his approach to life and kingship. Frederick treated his wife with unfailing courtesy, dignity, and respect in all public settings, fulfilling his dynastic obligations and maintaining proper appearances with his characteristic precision and attention to duty. But their private relationship remained distant, formal, and emotionally sterile throughout their long marriage. This loveless but politically advantageous marriage served to further stabilize and normalize Frederick's relationship with his father, while also demonstrating his willingness to subordinate personal desires and emotional needs to the larger interests of state policy and dynastic responsibility. This sacrifice of private happiness and personal fulfillment for public duty and political effectiveness became a recurring and characteristic theme throughout Frederick's life, as he repeatedly chose political effectiveness and state interests over personal satisfaction in ways that left him emotionally isolated and psychologically defended, but also politically powerful and strategically successful. The Crown Prince began to take on increasingly significant responsibilities within the Prussian government during the 1730s, providing him with invaluable practical experience in the complex challenges of administration, governance, and policy implementation that would prove absolutely essential to his later success as king. He was assigned to oversee major agricultural development projects designed to increase food production and rural prosperity, supervise tax collection operations in several important provinces, and participate in diplomatic negotiations with neighboring states and foreign powers. These varied administrative and diplomatic responsibilities allowed Frederick to observe firsthand how the kingdom actually functioned at the practical level, to understand the complex relationships between different government departments and administrative systems, and to develop his own sophisticated ideas about governance, reform, and the proper relationship between royal authority and administrative efficiency. The experience also taught him valuable lessons about the practical challenges of implementing policy decisions and the importance of understanding how government actually worked rather than simply relying on theoretical knowledge. Frederick's extensive administrative work during this period revealed both his exceptional intellectual sophistication and his growing practical understanding of political realities and administrative challenges. He demonstrated remarkable ability to analyze complex problems systematically, develop innovative and effective solutions, and implement policies with careful attention to practical details and potential complications that impressed even his demanding father and other experienced administrators. However, Frederick also began during this period to develop ideas about governance and reform that differed significantly from his father's more narrowly military approach to statecraft and royal authority. The prince became convinced through his practical experience and extensive reading that effective government in the modern world required not just military strength and administrative efficiency, but also systematic attention to economic development, legal reform, cultural advancement, and the general welfare and prosperity of the population. He began to formulate sophisticated theories about enlightened monarchy and the proper balance between royal authority and individual rights that would later influence his policies and reforms as king. These ideas drew heavily on his extensive reading in political philosophy and his ongoing correspondence with leading Enlightenment thinkers, but they were also shaped by his practical experience in administration and his first-hand observations of how government policies affected the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Frederick William I's health began to decline noticeably in the late 1730s, and it became increasingly clear that Frederick's accession to the throne was approaching relatively soon. The Crown Prince used this transitional period to prepare himself mentally, intellectually, and practically for the enormous responsibilities he would soon inherit as King of Prussia. He intensified his correspondence with philosophers and political theorists throughout Europe, refined and developed his ideas about military strategy and diplomatic relations, and began to develop detailed and comprehensive plans for the reforms and policy changes he would implement upon becoming king. The prince also used this crucial preparatory period to cultivate and strengthen relationships with key military officers, government administrators, and foreign diplomats who would be important to his future success as an effective ruler. Frederick demonstrated remarkable skill and sophistication in managing these complex relationships, combining intellectual discussion and philosophical conversation with practical political considerations in ways that earned him genuine respect and loyalty from diverse groups of people with varying backgrounds and interests. When Frederick William I finally died on May 31, 1740, the 28-year-old Crown Prince ascended to the throne as Frederick II, King in Prussia, in a transition that was remarkably smooth and well-managed, reflecting both Frederick's careful preparation during the preceding years and the respect he had gradually earned from key figures in the military and government establishment. Few observers could have predicted that this young man, who had once been dismissed by his father as weak, effeminate, and unsuitable for kingship, would become one of the most formidable rulers in European history and earn the epithet the Great through his extraordinary achievements in war, diplomacy, and domestic reform. The new king's first actions upon taking the throne revealed the remarkable complexity of his character and the unique blend of Enlightenment idealism and cold political pragmatism that would define and characterize his entire reign. On one hand, Frederick immediately implemented a comprehensive series of liberal reforms that reflected his philosophical beliefs and demonstrated his genuine commitment to enlightened principles of governance and justice. He immediately abolished the use of torture in judicial proceedings throughout his kingdom, established broad religious tolerance and freedom of worship for all faiths, initiated sweeping legal reforms designed to create a more just, efficient, and predictable system of government and law, and actively welcomed intellectuals, artists, scientists, and philosophers to his court. These early reforms earned him widespread admiration throughout enlightened Europe and seemed to confirm that a genuinely new type of ruler had emerged, one who could successfully combine philosophical sophistication with effective practical governance. Frederick also sent personal invitations to Voltaire and other leading intellectuals of the day to visit Prussia and participate in philosophical discussions at his court, positioning himself clearly as an enlightened monarch who would rule according to reason and justice rather than mere tradition and arbitrary power. These intellectual connections and philosophical commitments seemed to represent a dramatic break with the narrow militarism of his father's reign, and suggested that Prussia under Frederick would become a center of enlightened culture and rational governance. However, Frederick's actions in the realm of foreign policy and military strategy told a completely different story and revealed the calculating, opportunistic, and ruthlessly pragmatic side of his character that would prove equally important to his success as a ruler and military commander. Almost immediately after ascending to the throne, even while implementing his domestic reforms and courting European intellectuals, Frederick began secretly planning an aggressive military campaign that would shock Europe and establish him as one of the continent's most formidable military leaders. The target of this carefully planned campaign was Silesia, a wealthy and strategically important province controlled by Austria, but claimed by Prussia on the basis of dubious and largely manufactured legal grounds that Frederick's lawyers had skillfully constructed from obscure historical precedents and creative interpretations of ancient treaties. The decision to invade Silesia revealed Frederick's remarkable ability to combine long-term strategic thinking with opportunistic exploitation of immediate circumstances, and his willingness to use military force to achieve political objectives regardless of legal or moral considerations. Frederick had correctly recognized that Austria was in a particularly vulnerable position following the death of Emperor Charles VI and the accession of his daughter Maria Theresa to the Habsburg throne. Many European powers disputed Maria Theresa's right to inherit all of her father's territories under the provisions of the Pragmatic Sanction, and Frederick calculated that this period of uncertainty and potential succession crisis provided an ideal opportunity to seize valuable Austrian territory, while the Habsburg monarchy was distracted by other challenges to its authority and legitimacy. Silesia represented an extraordinarily valuable prize that would transform Prussia's position in European politics. The province had a population of over 1 million inhabitants and included important industries such as textile manufacturing, mining, and metalworking that would significantly boost Prussia's economic resources and military potential. Control of Silesia would nearly double Prussia's population and tax base while also providing strategic depth and improved defensive positions that would enhance the kingdom's military security and diplomatic influence. On December 16, 1740, just 7 months after becoming king, Frederick personally led a carefully prepared Prussian army of 27,000 men across the border into Silesia without any formal declaration of war or diplomatic warning to Austria. This sudden invasion marked the beginning of the First Silesian War and established Frederick immediately as a major player in European power politics, demonstrating that the young Prussian king was far from the weak, bookish, philosophically inclined ruler that some observers had expected based on his intellectual interests and early reforms. Frederick's conduct of the Silesian campaign revealed his military genius and strategic brilliance for the first time and established patterns of leadership and tactical innovation that would characterize his entire career as one of history's greatest military commanders. He combined meticulous strategic planning and careful logistical preparation with bold tactical innovation and creative exploitation of enemy weaknesses, using the superior discipline, training, and professional competence of the Prussian army to maximum advantage against less well-prepared opponents. His forces moved with remarkable speed, precision, and coordination, capturing key strategic points and important fortified positions before Austrian forces could mount an effective response or organize a coherent defense. Frederick's personal leadership style combined visible physical courage and battlefield presence with sophisticated strategic thinking and careful attention to the practical details of military logistics and supply that were essential to sustained campaign effectiveness. The Battle of Mollwitz, fought on April 10, 1741, was Frederick's first major military victory and established his reputation throughout Europe as a formidable general and innovative tactical commander. However, the battle began very poorly for the Prussians, with Frederick's cavalry being completely routed by Austrian horsemen in the opening stages of the engagement, creating a dangerous situation that threatened to turn into a catastrophic defeat for the supposedly superior Prussian army. Frederick's cavalry commander, General Kurt Christoph von Schwerin, fearing for the king's personal safety and concerned that his capture or death would be politically and militarily disastrous for Prussia, persuaded the young king to leave the battlefield temporarily while the outcome remained uncertain and dangerous. This decision initially embarrassed Frederick, who saw his departure as a potential failure of courage and leadership that might damage his reputation and authority. However, the superbly trained and disciplined Prussian infantry, led by Field Marshal Schwerin and other experienced officers, managed to turn the tide of battle through superior firepower, tactical discipline, and coordinated maneuvers that demonstrated the effectiveness of Frederick William I's military reforms and the high quality of Prussian military training and preparation. The Prussian foot soldiers maintained their formations and discipline under intense pressure and delivered devastating concentrated volleys that eventually broke the Austrian line and forced a general retreat. The final victory at Mollwitz was complete and decisive, with the Austrian army losing over 4,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with most of their artillery and military supplies, compared to Prussian losses of fewer than 1,000 men. This overwhelming tactical success validated Frederick's strategic decision to invade Silesia and demonstrated that the Prussian army was capable of defeating major European powers in direct military confrontation. Frederick was initially deeply embarrassed by his early departure from the Mollwitz battlefield, viewing it as a personal failure of courage that reflected poorly on his leadership abilities and personal honor as a king and military commander. However, he learned crucial and valuable lessons from this experience that would serve him extremely well in future campaigns and help shape his mature approach to military leadership and battlefield command. He realized through reflection and analysis that effective military leadership required not just personal courage and visible battlefield presence, but also careful planning, systematic preparation, attention to practical details, and the ability to adapt quickly and decisively to rapidly changing circumstances on the battlefield. More importantly, Frederick came to understand that his primary responsibility as king was to survive and continue providing leadership to Prussia, rather than to prove his personal bravery through unnecessary risks that might result in his capture or death. This realization led Frederick to develop a more sophisticated and strategically sound approach to battlefield leadership that balanced genuine personal courage with prudent caution about exposing himself to excessive danger. He learned to position himself where he could effectively observe and influence the battle while minimizing unnecessary risks, and to delegate tactical execution to competent subordinates while maintaining overall strategic control and decision-making authority. The victory at Mollwitz had far-reaching political and diplomatic consequences that extended well beyond the immediate military situation in Silesia and fundamentally altered the European balance of power. The decisive Prussian victory encouraged France and other major powers to enter the War of Austrian Succession on the side of Prussia, as they recognized an opportunity to weaken Austria's dominant position in Central Europe and gain territory and influence at Habsburg expense. Frederick had succeeded brilliantly in his primary strategic objective of making Prussia a major European power almost overnight, transforming Prussia from a relatively minor German state into a recognized great power whose military capabilities and political ambitions could no longer be ignored by the established European monarchies. However, Frederick had also created a complex web of alliances, conflicts, and competing interests that would shape European politics and warfare for decades to come, ultimately drawing Prussia into prolonged and dangerous conflicts that would test the kingdom's survival and Frederick's leadership abilities to their absolute limits. The diplomatic maneuvering and alliance building that followed the Mollwitz victory revealed another crucial aspect of Frederick's character and political methodology: his remarkably pragmatic and often ruthless approach to international relations and diplomatic negotiation. Frederick was consistently willing to make alliances and break them as circumstances required, always keeping Prussia's immediate and long-term interests as his primary and overriding concern, regardless of conventional diplomatic protocol or moral considerations about loyalty and consistency in international commitments. This realistic and strategically flexible approach to diplomacy, while often criticized as cynical and untrustworthy by more idealistic observers and rival powers who preferred traditional concepts of honor and loyalty in international relations, enabled Prussia to survive and even thrive in the extremely dangerous and competitive world of 18th-century European politics. Frederick understood intuitively that smaller powers like Prussia could not afford the luxury of sentimental attachments or rigid ideological commitments in their foreign relations, and that survival required constant adaptation to changing circumstances and opportunities. Frederick's remarkable success in the initial Silesian campaign also validated his innovative approach to military reform and tactical development, which built systematically on the solid foundation that his father had established while adding Frederick's own improvements and innovations to Prussian military doctrine and training methods. Frederick emphasized speed, mobility, and concentrated firepower over the more static and predictable warfare that had characterized much of early 18th century European military practice, developing new tactical formations and operational procedures that maximize the effectiveness of well-disciplined infantry and artillery units working in close coordination. The king also proved to be extraordinarily effective at managing the complex logistical challenges of 18th century warfare, understanding that armies truly did march on their stomachs and that reliable supply lines and adequate provisioning were often more important than tactical brilliance in determining campaign outcomes. His systematic attention to these practical but unglamorous details, combined with his strategic vision and tactical innovation, made the Prussian army one of the most effective and feared fighting forces in Europe and established Prussia as a military power that could successfully compete with much larger and more established states. After securing his initial conquest of Silesia through the victory at Malwitz and several subsequent successful military engagements, Frederick faced the complex challenge of consolidating his territorial gains while managing the broader European conflict that had emerged from his invasion and the shifting alliances that resulted from Prussia's sudden rise to major power status. The War of Austrian Succession had drawn in most of the major European powers, creating an intricate web of competing alliances and conflicting interests that required careful navigation and constant diplomatic attention. Frederick made the characteristically pragmatic decision to temporarily withdraw from active participation in the broader war in 1742, signing the separate Treaty of Berlin with Austria that confirmed Prussian control over most of Silesia in exchange for Prussia's withdrawal from the anti-Austrian coalition and its cessation of military operations against Habsburg forces. This decision to abandon his allies when it suited his immediate purposes demonstrated once again the calculating pragmatism and strategic flexibility that would characterize Frederick's entire approach to international relations and diplomatic strategy. Frederick justified this apparent betrayal of his coalition partners on purely practical grounds. He had achieved his primary strategic objective of conquering and securing Silesia, and continued participation in the broader European war would only expose Prussia to unnecessary risks and potential losses for uncertain and probably minimal gains. Frederick understood clearly that Prussia's military and economic resources were fundamentally limited compared to those of the great powers, and that the kingdom could not afford to participate in prolonged conflicts that did not directly serve its immediate strategic interests and territorial objectives. This period of temporary peace and diplomatic disengagement allowed Frederick to focus his attention and energy on internal reforms and domestic policy initiatives, providing him with a valuable opportunity to develop and implement his ideas about enlightened government in practical reality rather than merely in theoretical discussion and philosophical correspondence. He worked systematically and energetically to improve Prussia's administrative efficiency and governmental effectiveness, promoted religious tolerance and cultural development throughout his territories, and supported comprehensive educational reforms designed to create a more knowledgeable, capable, and productive citizenry. Frederick also began the construction of Sans Souci, his famous and architecturally innovative palace at Potsdam, which would serve as a center for philosophical discussion and artistic achievement, as well as a royal residence that reflected his sophisticated cultural tastes and intellectual commitments. The palace perfectly embodied Frederick's complex personality and unique approach to kingship, combining magnificent royal luxury and impressive ceremonial spaces with intimate areas specifically designed for intellectual conversation, artistic creation, and scholarly research. The design and decoration of Sans Souci expressed Frederick's distinctive vision of enlightened monarchy, where royal power and authority would be exercised in service of cultural and intellectual advancement, as well as political and military success. The palace became a symbol of Frederick's commitment to combining practical effectiveness in government with patronage of arts, sciences, and philosophy, demonstrating that successful rulership required attention to cultural and intellectual development, as well as military strength and administrative competence. The name Sans Souci itself, meaning without care in French, suggested Frederick's desire to create a space where the constant burdens and formal constraints of kingship could be temporarily set aside in favor of free intellectual discourse, artistic expression, and the pursuit of knowledge and understanding for their own sake. However, even in this supposedly relaxed and informal environment, Frederick maintained the psychological distance and emotional control that had become characteristic of his personality following the traumatic experiences of his youth. It was at Sans-Souci that Frederick's relationship with Voltaire, the great French philosopher, writer, and intellectual celebrity, reached its most intense, productive, and ultimately problematic phase. Voltaire visited Prussia several times during the 1740s and 1750s, engaging in extensive conversations with Frederick about philosophy, politics, literature, government, and the practical challenges of implementing enlightened principles in the real world of political power and social conflict. Their extensive correspondence and personal interactions provide invaluable insights into both men's thinking and intellectual development, representing one of the most important and influential intellectual relationships of the 18th century. The exchange of ideas between these two remarkable figures helped to shape contemporary understanding of enlightened monarchy, religious tolerance, legal reform, and the proper relationship between philosophical ideals and practical political reality. The relationship between Frederick and Voltaire was complicated and psychologically complex from the very beginning, mixing genuine intellectual respect and mutual admiration with personal manipulation, competitive ego conflicts, and occasional bitter disagreement about fundamental questions of philosophy and political practice. Both men were too intelligent, too strong-willed, too egotistical, and too accustomed to being the center of intellectual attention to maintain a simple, uncomplicated friendship based purely on shared interests and mutual respect. Voltaire was initially enchanted and fascinated by the idea of an enlightened monarch who seemed to embody the philosophical ideals and political reforms that he had been advocating throughout his career as a writer and social critic. Frederick appeared to represent the practical realization of Voltaire's theoretical vision of a philosopher king who would govern according to rational principles rather than arbitrary tradition, religious superstition, or personal caprice. Here was a king who wrote sophisticated poetry in French, composed and performed music, engaged seriously in philosophical discussion and intellectual debate, promoted religious tolerance and legal reform, and appeared to govern according to enlightened principles rather than mere dynastic tradition or personal ambition. For Voltaire, Frederick represented the tantalizing possibility that philosophical ideals could be successfully translated into practical political reality through the agency of an intellectually sophisticated and morally committed ruler. For his part, Frederick genuinely valued Voltaire's intellectual companionship, sophisticated conversation, and vast knowledge of European literature, philosophy, and culture. The king also recognized the significant prestige and intellectual credibility that came with having Europe's most famous and influential philosopher as a friend, correspondent, and occasional guest at his court. Voltaire's presence at Sans-Souci added enormously to the palace's reputation as a center of enlightened culture, and helped to establish Frederick's credentials as something more than merely a successful military commander and efficient administrator. Frederick also genuinely enjoyed Voltaire's wit, intelligence, and entertaining conversation, finding in the French philosopher an intellectual companion who could match his own sophisticated knowledge and analytical abilities. The king appreciated having someone with whom he could discuss complex ideas and philosophical questions without the normal constraints and limitations of royal protocol and hierarchical deference that characterized most of his other relationships. However, the relationship between the two men gradually deteriorated and became increasingly strained as both began to realize that the other was not quite what he had initially appeared to be or hoped to find. Voltaire slowly discovered that Frederick, for all his enlightened rhetoric and philosophical sophistication, remained fundamentally an absolute monarch who could be ruthless, calculating, and unforgiving when his political interests were threatened or his authority was challenged. The philosopher became increasingly disturbed by Frederick's casual willingness to use violence, deception, and manipulation in pursuit of political objectives, and he began to question whether truly enlightened governance was actually possible within the framework of absolute monarchy and concentrated royal power. Voltaire's idealistic vision of the philosopher king gradually gave way to a more realistic understanding of the inherent limitations and contradictions involved in combining philosophical ideals with practical political authority. Frederick, meanwhile, grew increasingly tired and frustrated with Voltaire's constant demands for special privileges and exceptional treatment, his persistent tendency to involve himself in court intrigues and political maneuvering, and his habit of using their personal friendship to advance his own financial interests and social position. The king began to see Voltaire as fundamentally manipulative and unreliable, someone who used philosophical rhetoric and intellectual reputation to disguise essentially selfish motivations and personal ambitions. Frederick's growing cynicism about human nature and personal relationships, reinforced by his experiences in war and diplomacy and shaped by the psychological trauma of his youth, made him increasingly suspicious of Voltaire's motives and less tolerant of his behavior and demands. The king's natural emotional distance and psychological defensiveness made it difficult for him to maintain close personal relationships, even with people he genuinely respected and admired. The final break between Frederick and Voltaire came in 1753, when their personal and philosophical differences could no longer be reconciled or ignored. The immediate cause was a complex dispute over a financial transaction involving Saxon bonds and questions about Voltaire's business dealings. But the underlying issue was their fundamentally different understanding of the proper relationship between philosophy and politics, between intellectual ideals and practical power. Voltaire left Prussia under something of a cloud, and while the two men continued to correspond occasionally and maintained a degree of mutual respect, their close personal relationship was permanently damaged and could never be fully restored. The episode taught Frederick valuable lessons about the limitations of intellectual friendship and the potential dangers of allowing personal relationships to complicate political judgment and decision-making. Meanwhile, the broader European political situation continued to evolve and develop in ways that would eventually draw Frederick back into major warfare, despite his strong preference for focusing on domestic reforms and cultural development rather than expensive and dangerous military adventures. The temporary peace that had followed the First Silesian War was gradually breaking down as the major powers repositioned themselves for renewed conflict, and Frederick watched these developments carefully and analytically, knowing that Prussia's newly won status as a major power would inevitably make it a target for other ambitious rulers and established powers. The diplomatic revolution of 1756 completely transformed the European balance of power and created the conditions for what would become known as the 7 Years' War, one of the most destructive and wide-ranging conflicts in 18th century European history. Traditional alliance systems were completely overturned as France formed an unprecedented alliance with Austria, its traditional enemy, while Britain aligned itself with Prussia in an equally surprising diplomatic reversal. This dramatic reversal of alliances, known to historians as the diplomatic revolution, was driven by changing strategic calculations, colonial rivalries, and shifting power relationships that made former enemies into allies while transforming former allies into potential threats. The new alliance system created a fundamentally unstable situation in which major powers found themselves aligned with states whose interests and objectives were not necessarily compatible with their own. Frederick found himself facing a formidable coalition of major powers that appeared determined to destroy Prussia's newfound prominence and restore the traditional balance of power in Central Europe by partitioning Prussian territory among its neighbors. The coalition against Prussia included Austria, which was naturally determined to recover Silesia and eliminate the Prussian threat to Habsburg dominance in Germany. France, which sought to expand its influence in German affairs and weaken British power through attacking Britain's only major continental ally. Russia, which viewed Prussian military success and territorial expansion as a dangerous threat to its own ambitions in Eastern Europe, and eventually Sweden, which hoped to recover territories lost to Prussia in previous conflicts. The military odds against Prussia seemed absolutely overwhelming by any rational calculation or objective analysis. The kingdom had a total population of only about 4.5 million inhabitants, while its enemies commanded the combined resources of some of Europe's largest and most powerful states, with populations, economic resources, and military potential that vastly exceeded anything Frederick could deploy against them. Austria, France, and Russia together could theoretically field armies that outnumbered Prussian forces by margins of 3 or 4 to 1, and they possessed the financial resources and logistical capabilities to sustain prolonged warfare that could potentially bankrupt Prussia and exhaust its limited manpower reserves. Most military experts and political observers throughout Europe confidently expected Prussia to be quickly overwhelmed and partitioned among its enemies, with Frederick either killed in battle or forced to flee into exile. The coalition against Prussia appeared to have every conceivable advantage. Superior numbers, greater economic resources, multiple fronts of attack that would prevent Frederick from concentrating his forces effectively, and the ability to coordinate their military operations against a single, relatively small, and apparently isolated target. The destruction of Prussian power seemed not just likely but virtually inevitable given the enormous disparity in resources and capabilities. However, Frederick possessed several crucial advantages that his enemies failed to fully appreciate or effectively counter during the initial phases of the conflict. The Prussian army, while significantly smaller than those of its opponents, was superbly trained, disciplined, and led by experienced officers who had proven their effectiveness in the Silesian Wars and had absorbed Frederick's tactical innovations and strategic methods. Frederick's military reforms had created one of the most professional, efficient, and tactically sophisticated fighting forces in Europe, capable of rapid movement, precise maneuvers, concentrated firepower, and devastating battlefield effectiveness when properly deployed under competent leadership. The Prussian military advantage lay not in numbers but in superior training, better leadership, more effective tactics, and higher levels of discipline and coordination that could potentially overcome numerical disadvantages under the right circumstances. Perhaps even more important was Frederick's own remarkable development as a military commander and strategic thinker during the intervening years since his first campaigns in Silesia. By 1756, he had become one of the finest generals of his age, with an intuitive understanding of strategy and tactics, an exceptional ability to analyze battlefield situations and exploit enemy weaknesses, and a talent for inspiring his troops and maintaining their morale under the most difficult and dangerous circumstances. Frederick also possessed a sophisticated strategic understanding of his situation that enabled him to develop effective responses to apparently impossible challenges. He recognized clearly that Prussia could not win a prolonged war of attrition against such powerful enemies, but he believed he could achieve ultimate victory through speed, surprise, superior tactics, and the ability to defeat his enemies separately before they could effectively coordinate their attacks and bring their full strength to bear against him. The king's strategic approach was based on the military principle of defeating in detail, using superior mobility and tactical skill to concentrate Prussian forces against isolated enemy armies, while avoiding battles against overwhelming odds or coordinated multi-front attacks. This approach required precise timing, excellent intelligence about enemy movements and intentions, and the ability to move forces rapidly between different theaters of operations, but Frederick believed it offered Prussia's only realistic chance of survival and ultimate victory. The 7 Years' War began in 1756 when Frederick launched a preemptive invasion of Saxony, correctly anticipating that his enemies were preparing to attack Prussia from multiple directions in a coordinated campaign designed to overwhelm his defenses before he could respond effectively. The invasion of Saxony was a carefully calculated strategic gamble designed to secure Prussia's vulnerable southern flank and gain control of Saxon military and economic resources before the major powers could mobilize their full strength against him. The campaign in Saxony demonstrated Frederick's military genius and strategic brilliance at its absolute finest and established the pattern of rapid, decisive action that would characterize his conduct of the entire war. Within a matter of weeks, he had completely surrounded the Saxon army at Pirna, cutting off their supplies and communications, and forced their surrender without fighting a major battle, effectively neutralizing one potential enemy and gaining access to valuable military resources, including experienced soldiers who were subsequently incorporated into the Prussian army. The speed, efficiency, and tactical sophistication of the Saxon operation sent shockwaves throughout Europe and demonstrated conclusively that Frederick remained a formidable and dangerous opponent despite being outnumbered by his enemies. The campaign also provided Frederick with a strong defensive position in central Germany and access to Saxon economic and military resources that would help sustain Prussia through the long and difficult war ahead. The victory in Saxony was followed by one of Frederick's greatest and most celebrated military triumphs, the Battle of Rossbach on November 5, 1757. Facing a combined French and Austrian army under the command of the Prince de Soubise that outnumbered his forces by nearly 2-1, Frederick achieved a devastating and complete victory through superior tactics, perfect timing, exceptional leadership, and the outstanding discipline and training of his troops. At Rossbach, Frederick demonstrated his absolute mastery of the oblique attack, a tactical innovation that he had developed and refined over years of study and practical experience. This sophisticated maneuver allowed him to concentrate his forces against a specific portion of the enemy line while avoiding a costly frontal assault against superior numbers, achieving local numerical superiority at the decisive point while maintaining overall tactical flexibility and operational mobility. The oblique attack required precise timing, perfect coordination between cavalry, infantry, and artillery, exceptional discipline from all participating units, and sophisticated understanding of terrain and battlefield dynamics. But when executed properly by well-trained troops under competent leadership, it could achieve decisive results even against numerically superior opponents who possessed conventional tactical advantages. The battle began with Frederick's forces appearing to retreat, drawing the overconfident Franco-Austrian army into pursuit across broken and unfavorable terrain that gradually disrupted their formations and separated their units. At the critical moment, when the enemy was extended and vulnerable, Frederick wheeled his entire army to the left and struck the exposed enemy flank with concentrated and overwhelming force, while his cavalry under the brilliant leadership of General Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz charged into the confused and disorganized enemy ranks. The battle lasted only about 90 minutes, but it resulted in the complete destruction of the Franco-Austrian army as an effective fighting force, with over 10,000 casualties and prisoners compared to Prussian losses of fewer than 1,000 men. The victory was so complete and devastating that it effectively ended French participation in the German theater of the war and established Frederick's reputation as one of the greatest tactical commanders in military history. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that Frederick the Great story shows us how extraordinary achievements often emerge from the synthesis of apparent contradictions. His legacy reminds us that greatness in leadership comes not from perfection, but from the ability to balance competing demands, learn from failures, and remain true to core principles while adapting methods to changing circumstances. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please give this video a like and subscribe to History Bedtime Stories for more fascinating tales from the past. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is as you drift off to these historical adventures. Until next time, Sleep well and dream of the remarkable figures who shaped our world.